Welcome, self-proclaimed humans. Today is January the 29th. We are approaching the end of this week, and we're also approaching our weekly update on the situation in the raid. We checked this the last time about 10 days ago, and since last time something quite interesting happened, which is patch 10.0.5. Also, since last time, we have now gotten even more time to inspect the changes happening on January the 9th, the significant round of buffs to quite a few specs, and being able to see how much they have affected the specs, in this case in the raid. And they did. We will definitely see today quite a few changes to the specs performance in the raid. Now, to make it short, as I always say and never actually do, to make it short, the popularity of the specs when it comes to the raid is not really changing. In just 10 days or so, we are not seeing too many swaps around. We can see some tiny increases over the different choices. For example, the choice between Fury and Arms this week. Arms is doing slightly more. The choice between Demonology and Destruction and Affliction. This week, Demo is doing worse, and Affliction and Destruction are gaining more numbers. Also, Arcane is getting a few less numbers, a few less logs in favor of Frost Mage. Beast Mastery Hunter is getting a few more logs in favor of Marksmanship. But these are not the things that interest us for today. What is interesting us is the performance, is the ranking, the meta, the logs, because we have quite a few changes for this week. So this right here is the chart, the rankings of about 10 days ago, where we stopped. This was, I think, the 18th or the 19th of January. It was about 10 days after the hotfix of January the 9th, where a few specs were buffed. And the situation, so we talked back then about the changes to Red Paladin and the changes to Devastation Evoker, which put them in top 4. Now, 10 more days after that, and also a few days after patch 10.0.5, this is where we are. Now, on top of having Red Paladin and Devastation Evoker in the top 5, top 7 of specs, we have 2 more additions, even 3. If you will. We have the addition of Feral Druid entering in 7th position, we have the addition of Shadow Priest entering in 6th, and then we have the addition of Arms Warrior entering in 4th. This is currently the new landscape of the top performing specs in the raid when it comes to all of the encounters in an overall type of ranking. We can also see at the same time that towards the bottom not many things have changed. We still see all of the mage specs in the bottom half, all of the warlock specs in the bottom half, and now with Marksmanship Hunter progressively losing ranks, also all of the hunter specs towards the bottom half. So not much changing over there. It's quite interesting. You could say that this is perhaps one of the weirdest top rankings we have seen so far. How many times can you say you have seen in WoW's metas in PvE, you have seen all of warlocks, all of mages, and all of hunter specs being subpar, while at the same time a whole bunch of different hybrid specs being towards the top. Hybrids like Windwalker, Feral, Shadow, Retribution, and now we can even add Devastation to the mix. So it's quite the unique situation we have right now. And you know, it was a unique situation handcrafted by Blizzard, because if we look at the top 7, which of these specs has been buffed, either on the hotfix 3 weeks ago or on the 10.0.5 patch of a few days ago? The answer is 5 out of 7. Feral has been buffed, Shadow Priest has been buffed in both occasions, Retribution Paladin has been buffed, Arms has been giga buffed in this last patch, Devastation Evoker has been buffed in the hotfix of January the 9th. So, pretty much all of the specs in the top 7, with the exception of the 2 rogue specs, have all been buffed recently. It seems like, for the moment, not all buffs are equal, because specs like Fire Mage, specs like Frost Mage, Destruction, Affliction, as well as specs like Fury Warrior, they too have been buffed, but at the moment we are not really seeing the results, at the very least when it comes to the raid. performance. Now you can go boss by boss as well, since sometimes, the overall performance can be quite misleading in terms of how specs are actually doing. So you can go by the results of boss by boss to see the different powers, the different strengths for each spec. For example, Eranog, which has the possibility to have some powerful AoE burst windows. You can see that Devastation and Red Paladin are the two specs of our newly buffed specs being in the top. Then you have Terros, which is a pure single target fight, no excuse, no cheese, just one target, and the only spec being buffed that is in there is arms. As you can see, Devastation, Shadow Priest, Feral, Retribution, none of them is doing particularly well on Terros. You go back to an AoE situation, constant AoE of Council and Shadow Priest and Feral and Devastation are all doing quite well, while Red Paladin and Arms are not doing nearly as well. A few more interesting points like Dathia, which is a split situation, single target on the boss and tons of AoE on the platforms, on the ads. Once again, we see Arms Warrior, actually the second best spec on Dathia, and then Evoker and Red Paladin being towards the top half of performers on Dathia, while Red, Shadow Priest and Feral are doing okay, but nothing special. What is perhaps more interesting is that finally now we have a little bit more logs, we have a few more entries that we can start looking at Diurna logs. Of course, as you can see by the lines, by the brackets of each specs, right now it's still kind of wacky to look at Diurna, but we can see still that Red Paladin, Feral Druid and Devastation Evoker are three of our buffed specs currently in the top 5 on the Diurna fight. To visualize an overall of the changes, because if you have specs gaining a lot, you must have quite a few other specs losing out in the end. So for starters, we have the two most D-ranked specs, Unholy Death Knight and Assassination Rogue, in the past 3 weeks. Since the first buff to specs on January the 9th, they have lost 11 ranks, 11 positions in the overall rankings since before that hotfix, followed by Enhancement, which was looking pretty hot back then. Now they have lost 8 positions. This is juxtaposed to specs like Feral, who gained 10 rankings, Shadow Priest, who gained 13 and is currently our biggest growth out of all specs. Retribution Paladin gained 7. Devastation Evoker is our second biggest growth because they gained 12 positions in 3 weeks. Those two, Shadow Priest and Devastation Evoker, were also the biggest of the buffs on January the 9th. And lastly, you have Arms Warrior, which gained 5 positions. Arms is also currently one of the bigger buffs of 10.0.5. So we can see perhaps later on in a few more weeks some bigger gains to Arms Warrior. And to finish out, we have Elemental Shaman, who lost 8 positions, and Marksmanship Hunter, who lost 9 positions in about 3 weeks. So this was our top 10, our 10 highest or lowest amount of gains or losses of the specs over the last 3 or so weeks and over the last 2 rounds of balance tuning going live in the game. We can show the actual growth or the actual loss of the specs in this graph over here, starting on January the 9th, starting on the first of the hotfix buffs. And you can see that both Devastation and Shadow Priest effectively have almost immediately an upward rise. Just 1 or 2 days after the weekly reset with the hotfix, they jump up significantly, and now they are all the way up to the top 2 performers when it comes to ranged DPS. The comparison then goes on to the melee DPS, once again starting from January the 9th. You can see that right after the hotfix you have Retribution Paladin starting to grow quite a bit. You also have Feral Druid starting to grow quite a bit. Similarly, you have both of the DK specs and Assassination Rogue actually starting to lose out after a while, and then you can see the difference of Arms Warrior. Arms Warrior getting the buffs on 10.0.5 rather than the hotfix. So their growth is much more recent, the growth of Arms Warrior is, compared to Ret and to Feral, which started to grow already 2 or 3 weeks ago. At the end of the day, after all of these changes happening in the raid, what we are left with are the tier lists. Are the tier lists based on some pretty logical conclusions based on the numbers of the specs in the raid and their performance. The healing rankings, at the very least for now, in the raid look like this, with Evoker being first and Druid being second. This is more or less the same but reversed when it comes to Mythic Plus. So at the moment those two are the main meta specs for the season. We will have to see as we go deeper into this patch the buffs given to Discipline, to Resto Shaman and to Mistweaver Monk to see if something will be done, if something will change to their bottom position, which for the moment they are still keeping when it comes to healers. When it comes to tanks, of course, it's much less important to gauge this type of thing when it comes to raiding, right? This is not really that relevant, really that important when it comes to raid meta of tanks, especially because you don't really gauge the power of tanks by their performance in the raid, by their DPS or their HPS in the raid. So this is much less valuable. Then you have the DPS. This is of course much more valuable. The DPS of course have what we just pointed out, a couple of things that we just pointed out. Number one being of course arms. Arms now being into the S tier, based also on their performance, together still in S tier with Outlaw and with Havoc. We still have a few of the other, classic picks that we have seen for quite a few weeks in there already. At the top, Enhancement, Windwalker, Subtlety and Fury Warrior. What is perhaps a bit more interesting is the much lower position of Red Paladin, which we just mentioned performing much better in the overall meters in the raid. Here, actually calculating and gauging their performance overall doesn't look nearly as impressive. What looks impressive, of course, is Survival still being F tier, absolutely no hope whatsoever. Lastly, you have the Range DPS. Range DPS have what we mentioned, the number one best performing currently range DPS spec in the overall meters being Devastation. Actually turns out to be true, even in here as well. S tier, the only spec for the range DPS being in there is Devastation, followed by Arcane and Balanced Druid. This is perhaps the more interesting pick, given by the fact that neither Arcane or Balanced Druid are particularly performing well at the moment. Balanced Druid, yes, it's still technically speaking the third better performing of the range DPS specs, but Arcane technically speaking right now it's here, right? Arcane, if we just looked at the overall rankings, would be below Fire, below Demo, below Elemental, below Frost Mage, below Affliction, below Marksmanship, below Balance, Shadow Priest and Devastation. So this is painting definitely a much different picture compared to just the overall rankings of the DPS, with Arcane being in the second tier of performing DPS specs together with Balanced Druid. A surprise in the B tier out of nowhere, we have Elemental Shaman. Elemental Shaman, we pointed out, has been dropping down in rankings in the overall meters compared to, for example, a spec that has been growing significantly like Shadow Priest. Shadow Priest, despite the much better performance and the entry in the top 5 of performers in the raid, hasn't really gotten that much better at the moment when it comes to raid rankings in a tier list so far. But then again, perhaps this might be attributed to just being a little bit slow on updating, or perhaps just having to take a few more days to get these rankings to sort of spread out, even out, and become a little bit more clear who has been buffed, who is doing clearly better and who isn't. Although, to be fair, the recently buffed Devastation has been quite clear in how better it's become compared to Shadow Priest, so maybe that's not the reason why. However, these were the results so far. As I pointed out, I thought it was quite interesting and also quite hilarious, okay? Quite funny to me to see so many hybrid specs, so many traditionally not very popular, traditionally not very meta specs doing very well. This has gone on pretty much for the entire tier, okay? Since we started checking these type of things, we have seen specs like Unholy or Frost Decay being towards the top. We have seen specs like Enhancement Shaman being towards the top. Now these specs have sort of fallen down a bit, but they have been replaced by specs like Feral, Shadow Priest, Retribution Paladin, so you know, specs not very popular, specs kind of niche compared to hunters, compared to mages, compared to warlocks. So I find it quite funny, I find it quite humorous that this has definitely not been the meta of the super popular specs so far in this Season 1. At the very least when it comes to the ranged DPS, that's for sure. Melee, well, melee is still Rogues and Havoc Demon Hunter, okay? Nothing new. Super boring still, but the range DPS have been quite the surprise for this first season. So with this surprise being taken care of in this weekly raid update, I think this is week 6, I think it should be, we are going to leave each other on this Sunday, as I am supposed to go read up a little bit more on Razaget strats, so it's time for me to leave as well. I'm going to start my goodbyes by thanking all of my Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of this channel. Don't worry, you can still support without having to spend any money. Liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel as well, are perfectly fine ways to show your support. You can still support as well by following me on Twitter, right over at this link. This will help you as well to get notified on whenever I go live on my stream or whenever I have things to communicate to all of my viewers. That would be the fastest and easiest way to be caught up with the news. And lastly, of course, technically speaking, I am being told sometimes I go live on stream on Twitch, starting generally speaking from 10 PM Central European Times, 1 PM Pacific and 4 PM Eastern US time zones. With this out of the way, thank you guys again for watching, see you guys soon, and in the meantime, today was the 5th day in a row I woke up before noon. I am afraid I'm about to be hospitalized for some severe illness.